The sun was sinking low over the Wyoming plains when the girl staggered back toward the bunkhouse, a dented tin pail sloshing water down her torn skirt. All day the ranch hands had laughed at her, calling her the boss's charity case, and betting she wouldn't last till sundown. But by dusk, every man at that long table had set his cup in front of her, waiting for her to pour, silent as church pews. Nobody could have guessed it that morning, but before the last rays burned out over the hills, that poor white girl with blistered hands and a back bent from hauling would earn something you couldn't buy in gold or whiskey, their respect on a ranch. Well, that was the start of everything. But what drove her to that moment? And why did the water matter so damn much? Clara May Higgins wasn't the sort of girl anybody noticed twice. Thin shoulders, straw-colored hair, always tied back in a frayed ribbon, eyes washed out blue, like they'd been left too long in the sun. Folks would say she looked more worn than 17 years ought to allow. Truth was, Clara had never been given the chance to be young. Her people were tenant farmers who'd scraped a living out on the Platte River. Then came the storms, hailsales hard as walnuts, breaking wheat flat against the soil. Next year locusts poured down like rain, chewing what little they had left. 3 years of ruin, and her daddy finally walked off toward Cheyenne, muttering about wages on the railroad. He never came back. Some say he fell into a camp card game and lost his life to a knife. Others reckon he hopped a train and kept going till the tracks ran out. Clara never asked. She'd learned early that some questions just hurt worse than the answer. By spring of 1884, her mama was coughing herself thin in a drafty shack, the roof patched with canvas, the floor more dirt than board. Clara worked odd jobs mending clothes, scrubbing floors, hauling slop for neighbors just to buy flour, but it wasn't enough. She needed steady work, and she needed it fast. That's how she ended up at the Barlow Ranch, 30 miles west, standing on the porch of the foreman's house, with her hat clutched to her chest. "Girl, you know what you're asking," Foreman Talbot had said, squinting at her through smoke. He was a slab of a man, shirt sleeves rolled past thick forearms, gray stubble crawling across his jaw. "This ain't no place for charity. We work here, hard. Ain't no corners to cut, not for me, not for any of 'em boys in the bunkhouse." Clara didn't flinch. "I don't need charity, sir. I'll earn my keep." He chuckled, dry as gravel. "And just how you reckon you'll do that? These are cowhands. Ain't no chore softer 'n the others. Water to haul, wood to split, stock to feed. Ain't nothing gentle here." "I'll carry water," Clara said, "every day. All they need." That stopped him. He leaned back in his chair, pipe stem tapping against his teeth. Hauling water was the job nobody wanted. The ranch's spring was 300 yards downhill, a cruel walk under the sun, and every pail meant sweat. The men usually drew lots. Whoever lost cursed his luck all day. "You'll fetch water," Talbot repeated, measuring her with his eyes. "Every pail for every man, rain or shine. Think you got the back for it?" "I'll make the back for it," Clara answered. And that's how it started. First morning, the bunkhouse door swung open, and a wave of rough laughter rolled over her. 15 men, all dust and denim, spurs clinking as they crowded into the long room with its plank table. They'd heard already. The foreman had told them. "Hell," one of them said. "Talbot's brought us a water ferry." Another tipped his hat in mock greeting. "Careful, boys, don't scare her off. We'll be drinking dust if she quits." Their cups clattered onto the table, tin and enamel weight. Clara picked up the pail, hands trembling, and made her first walk to the spring. The path wound downhill through prairie grass, alive with crickets, the heat already baking up from the earth. She filled the bucket, water cold enough to sting her finger. Then the hard part, hauling it back uphill. By halfway her arms burned. By 3/4 her breath rasped. She stopped, set it down, flexed her hands. Then she picked it up again. When she staggered into the bunkhouse, water splashing over her skirt, the men hooted. "Didn't spill too much, boys. Oughta be enough to wet your throats." "Careful there, missy. Ain't no use if you drown before dinner." Clara didn't answer. She just poured, one cup at a time, steady as she could. Then she turned, pail empty, and walked back out. She did it again and again and again. By noon her palms were raw, blisters swelling. Sweat ran down her spine, staining the cotton of her dress. The men laughed less, but their eyes still watched like hawks, waiting for her to drop. "Reckon she'll quit by sundown," one muttered. "Bet you 2 bits she don't make supper," said another. But Clara May Higgins wasn't built to quit. Every trip she told herself, one more, just one more. By late afternoon her legs shook with every step. Her shoulders screamed. The sun bled low, painting the hills in fire. She thought of her mama lying back in that shack, coughing in her sleep, and somehow she lifted that pail again. When she pushed open the bunkhouse door at dusk, the men didn't laugh. They didn't even speak. They just held out their cups, quiet as church, and let her pour. Now, here's the thing nobody knew at that moment. Respect on a ranch wasn't cheap. It wasn't given with kind words or pretty looks. It had to be earned in sweat, blood, and grit. And Clara, that poor girl with blistered hands, had just taken her first step towards something far bigger than she understood. But the question lingered like smoke. Was carrying water enough to hold her place among them, or would the first real storm wash her away? The morning after Clara's first day, the ranch hands woke to the sound of the pump creaking and tins sloshing. She was already on her second trip from the spring, before most of them had pulled on their boots. The men shuffled to the long table, hair uncombed, eyes bleary from whiskey and smoke. But when Clara stepped through the doorway, her dress darkened with sweat. There was no laughter this time. Just a few quiet looks passed between them, as if each was waiting for the other to break the silence. Then Hank Rourke, oldest of the lot with a beard like tangled rope, leaned back in his chair and spat. "Girl's got grit, I'll give her that. But grit don't last long when the sky turns cruel." Clara met his gaze, steady. "Neither does whiskey, Mr. Rourke, but you drink it anyway." The room erupted in hoots and hollers. Hank slammed his palm on the table, not in anger, but amusement, and the others laughed even harder. "She's got a tongue sharp as a branding iron. Careful, boys, she'll slice you up before breakfast." But laughter didn't mean acceptance. On a ranch, words were lighter than dust. The real test was still waiting, and Clara didn't yet know it. By midday, Talbot had put the men to work riding fence lines and checking strays. Clara, left with the endless water hauling, thought the heat might burn her lungs raw. The sun seemed bigger out here, heavier somehow, like it was pressing down to see if she'd break. On her 4th trip down to the spring, she heard boot steps behind her. She turned to see a young cowboy falling in stride. Cal Boone, all of 19, with hair black as coal and a smile that carried too much mischief. "Talbot says you're stubborn," he said. "Can't tell if that's good or foolish." Clara didn't stop walking. "Depends who's calling it. You aim to haul every pail, 15 men all summer. I aim to do what I promised." He chuckled. "That's more than most around here can say." Then his tone shifted, soft, "But promises'll break you if you don't watch yourself." She didn't answer. Instead, she bent to dip the bucket into the spring, water flashing silver in the light. Her arms shook as she lifted it. Cal watched her for a moment, then reached to take the hand. "I don't need," she started. "I know you don't," he cut in. "But I ain't letting you keel over the first week." Together they hauled it back uphill, silence heavy between them. That evening Clara ladled out water to the men as usual, but when she reached Hank Rourke, he didn't lift his cup. Instead he set a calloused hand over it. "Tell me something, girl," he drawled. "Why's a slip like you breaking her back on a ranch instead of tending her kin back home?" The room went quiet. Even the younger cowboys stopped their chewing. Clara froze. Her mother, the shack, the cough. She swallowed hard. "Because home don't put bread on the table," she said finally. "Not anymore." Rourke narrowed his eyes as though weighing the truth of her word. Then he pushed his cup forward. "Fair enough." But the question lingered in the smoke-filled room, and Clara knew it would rise again. Out here, secrets never stayed buried for long. The next days blurred into each other. Sun up, water carried, sun down, bones aching. The men stopped betting on how long she'd last. They stopped jeering. But that didn't mean they trusted her. She was tolerated, nothing more. Then came the fire. It was late afternoon when the cry went up. Smoke. South pasture. The men leapt to their feet, grabbing hats, ropes, and sacks. Clara followed them outside to see black plumes curling up against the horizon. Prairie fires were no small matter. A single spark could eat miles of grass, take cattle, horses, and men alike. Water, Talbot barked. Buckets. Fire. The men tore down toward the creek, filling whatever they could. Buckets, pans, even hats. Anything to fight the blaze licking over the hill. Clara ran with them, her lungs searing from smoke before they'd even reached the fire line. The flames moved fast, wind driving them like a whip. Men shouted, coughing, slapping at sparks with wet burlap. Clara dropped to her knees, filled her bucket, and threw water until her arms screamed. Ash fell into her hair. Heat singed her face. A cow bellowed somewhere close, panicked and wild. Back, it's turning, someone shouted. The fire jumped, racing sideways toward a small pen where calves bawled, trapped against a fence. Clara saw it before anyone else. The dry wood would go up in seconds, and those calves had nowhere to run. Without thinking, she grabbed her pail and sprinted. Girl, get back, Talbot roared, but she didn't hear, or maybe she didn't care. Smoke swallowed her as she reached the pen, coughing, eyes watering. The fence posts were already catching, flames crawling up like fingers. Clara heaved water over them, useless against the fury, then threw her shoulder against the latch. It stuck, swollen from heat. She screamed, yanked, and at last it gave way. The calves bolted, scattering into the open, and Clara stumbled after them, choking. Strong arms caught her, Cal Boone dragging her clear, his bandana pulled over his face. He hauled her back toward the others just as the pen collapsed in a shower of sparks. When it was over, the fire lay smoldering across blackened earth, beaten down by sweat and desperation. The men stood in the glow, soot covering their faces, shirts torn and damp. Talbot spat into the ashes, shaking his head. Then Hank Rourke spoke, voice rough. Girl near got herself roasted for a bunch of calves. She saved 'em, Cal shot back, eyes flashing. Rourke nodded slowly, eyes on Clara. Ain't no one he'll forget it. Neither. And in that silence, broken only by the crackle of dying flames, something shifted. The men no longer looked at Clara like an outsider. They looked at her like one of their own. But respect is a double-edged thing. The more you earn, the more folks and for Clara, the next trial would cut deeper than any fire. Because some men weren't ready to let her belong, and one in particular had already decided she was nothing but trouble. After the fire, things were different, not softer. No, nothing softened on the Barlow Ranch, but different. The men no longer made bets about her quitting. They no longer called her fairy or charity. When Clara walked into the bunkhouse at dawn, pale, sloshing, the cowhands tipped their hats, some out of habit, others out of respect. Still, respect's a slippery thing. Earn it once, and you buy yourself a little space. Keep it, and you've got to earn it again and harder. The one man who made no secret of it was Eli Cutter, tall with shoulders like a barn beam and eyes cold as river stone. Cutter had worked the ranch since before Clara was born. He wasn't old, not yet 30, but he carried himself like he'd seen every hard thing the world had to offer. Cutter didn't laugh the night she snapped at Hank Rourke, and he didn't say a word when she pulled those calves from the fire. He just watched her, jaw tight, like a man measuring a problem he hadn't yet solved. It started small, a boot left in her path so she tripped and spilled half a pail. A coil of rope accidentally snagging her dress so she stumbled in front of the men. Cutter never laughed, never smiled at his own tricks. He just watched to see how she'd react. Clara didn't give him the satisfaction. She bit down her anger, straightened her back, and hauled the next load of water. But every time she thought she'd matched the men's grit, Cutter would find some way to remind her she hadn't. One night, after a long day riding fence, the men sat at the table, bowls of beans steaming before them. Clara ladled out water as always, her arms aching. When she reached Cutter, he kept his cup flat on the table. "You're late," he said. The room quieted. I hauled as fast as I could, Clara replied. Fast enough would have been before supper, Cutter said, his voice like gravel. Not after. Talbot looked up from his plate ready to speak, but Clara surprised them all. She leaned down, poured the last of the pail into Cutter's cup, until it brimmed. Then you'd best drink slow, she said, so you don't run out before tomorrow. The bunkhouse erupted in laughter, even Hank Rourke slapping the table till his beans sloshed. But Cutter didn't laugh. He lifted the cup, drank deep, and set it down without blinking. His eyes never left hers. That night Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow cot Talbot had given her in the washroom, listening to the wind moan through the boards. Cutter's stare burned in her mind. Respect was one thing, open defiance was another. Out here, men didn't forgive easily, and Cutter wasn't the sort to forgive. By morning, the trouble found her. Clara. Cal Boone's voice rang sharp across the yard. She turned to see him waving her over. He was pale, sweat beading his forehead. The well rope snapped, he said. Buckets down in the shaft. It was the backup well, deeper than the spring. Cold water that kept through summer when the creek ran low. A snapped rope meant no way to haul the bucket without sending someone down. Clara glanced at the others gathering. Cutter stood among them, arms folded, a faint curl to his lip. Reckon we'll see if the girl's still so handy, he said. Talbot scowled. Ain't no sense risking a slip down that hole. It's 30 feet straight. I'll send 2 men with hooks. I'll go, Clara interrupted. Heads turned. You? Hank barked. I'm small enough to fit. Tie a line. Lower me down. I'll bring it up. Talbot shook his head. It's black as pitch down there. If you miss your grip, then don't let me fall, Clara said, her voice steady. For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Cutter stepped forward. Fine. Tie her off. Let's see if she can pull more than calves from a fire. The well mouth yawned dark, boards creaking as the men braced a rope. Clara tied it around her waist, her palms slick. She lowered herself inch by inch, the sunlight shrinking above her, shadows swallowing her whole. The air grew damp, cool against her skin. She heard the echo of her own breath. Keep steady, Cal called, his voice faint above. Her boots scraped against stone until they hit damp earth. She crouched, blinking in the dark. The bucket lay half submerged, rope frayed clean through. Clara wrapped her arms around it, tugging the knot free with raw fingers. I've got it, she shouted, voice bouncing off the walls. Hold tight, came Talbot's reply. The rope creaked, and she felt herself lift, water sloshing below. Halfway up, the line jerked hard. Clara gasped, slamming against the stones. The rope slipped, fibers grinding against her waist. Above, voices shouted. Someone had loosened the knot. Her heart thundered. For a moment, she dangled in darkness, the abyss yawning beneath her. Then Cal's voice fierce. Hold her steady. Don't you let go. The rope jerked again, this time pulling her upward, hand over hand, rough and fast. At last, she burst back into sunlight, coughing, clutching the bucket like a newborn. The men hauled her over the lip, breathless, dripping with cold. She looked up through her wet hair, eyes locking on Cutter. His hands were clean. He hadn't touched the rope, but the way he stood there, calm as a stone, Clara knew he wanted to see her fall. That night, the bunkhouse buzzed with talk. Some swore the knot had just slipped. Others whispered that Cutter had been too close to the line, too quiet, too willing. Talbot said nothing, but his eyes followed Cutter long after the lamps burned low. Clara lay awake again, her body aching from the rope's bite. She thought of her mama back in the shack, coughing. She thought of the fire, the calves, the dark pit of the well, and she realized something that made her stomach turn. Hauling water wasn't the hardest part of this job. Surviving Cutter's shadow was. The men respected her more than ever now. Even Hank tipped his hat, muttering, "Girls got more steel than half the lot of us." But Cutter's silence carried weight. Out here, silence was never empty. It was a warning, and soon Clara would learn just how far he'd go to break her. The storm rolled in without warning, one of those high plains tempests that builds out of nothing, black clouds piling like mountains over the horizon. By dusk, thunder was growling low, and lightning stitched the sky in jagged white scars. The men hustled horses into the corral, nailed shutters against the wind. Inside the bunkhouse, lamps swayed, shadows jumping across the plank walls. Clara hauled water as always, though her arms felt heavier than ever. She tried not to notice Cutter's eyes following her. He hadn't spoken more than 2 words in days, but silence doesn't mean peace. Out here, it means something's coming. When the thunder cracked close, the men settled in for the night. Cards slapped on the table, whiskey jars passed from hand to hand. Hank Rourke laughed loudest, as if daring the storm outside to match him. Cal Boone sat near the window, strumming a battered guitar soft enough to barely cut through the roar. Clara ladled water cup by cup, her mind elsewhere, because she could feel it, the air inside thick as the storm out there. Cutter was coiled tight, waiting. It happened when the cards turned against him. Cutter slammed his hand on the table, coins scattering. Cheating, he growled. Nobody's cheating. Hank barked back. Luck's just sour, that's all. Cutter's jaw tightened. His eyes slid to Clara standing near the door with her empty pail. Maybe luck soured when Talbot started bringing in strays. First it was greenhorn boys, now it's girls who don't know their place. The room went dead quiet. Even the thunder outside seemed to wait. Clara's hands gripped the pail. She wanted to speak, but her throat felt dry as the prairie dust. Cal set his guitar aside, voice even. That girl hauled more water and pulled more weight in 3 weeks than half of us in 3 years. Don't start. But Cutter did. He rose slow, chair legs scraping the floor. Respect ain't earned by playin' maid. Respect's earned by standing. When a man pushes you down. Then he stepped toward Clara. You think you belong here. His voice was low, meant only for her, but heard by all. You think hauling pails and pulling calves makes you one of us. You're a burden, girl. Always were, always will be. Clara's heart hammered. Every eye in the bunkhouse was on her. She could shrink back and let him win, or she could step. Her mama's words echoed faint in her memory. Don't let the world tell you what you're worth. Show him. She lifted the pail, empty, light as tin, but it was all she had. If I'm a burden, she said steady, then try and carry me. See how far you get. The men sucked in breath. Some grinned, others winced. Hank muttered, Lord help us. For a long moment Cutter just stared, stormlight flashing in his eyes. Then he laughed, a sound more dangerous than anger. Outside, he said. Now. The bunkhouse spilled out into the storm. Rain slashed sideways, soaking them in seconds, thunder splitting the night. The men formed a loose ring in the mud, faces lit by lightning. This wasn't just a fight, it was a reckoning. Cutter stepped forward, fists clenched. Clara's knees shook, but she stood her ground. Cal leaned close. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, she cut in. And before he could stop her, Cutter swung. The blow caught her shoulder, spinning her sideways into the mud. The men roared, some cheering, some shouting for it to stop. Clara gasped, pushed herself up, mud dripping from her hair. Cutter loomed above, waiting for her to quit. She didn't. She lunged, swinging the pail like a club. It cracked against his ribs with a hollow clang. He staggered, surprised more than hurt. She swung again, catching his arm, then his jaw. The men shouted, half in disbelief, half in thrill. Cutter snarled, caught the pail mid-swing, and yanked it free. He tossed it aside, hands closing around her shoulders. Clara kicked, clawed, fought like a cornered wildcat. And then Hank's voice boomed, enough. The men surged forward, tearing them apart. Clara stumbled back, chest heaving, blood at her lip. Cutter spat mud, eyes blazing. She ain't one of us, he spat. Not now, not ever. But Hank stepped between them, rain pouring down his face. You're wrong, Cutter. She's more one of us than you'll ever be. She's earned her place. You've just lost yours. The ring went silent. Even the storm seemed to hush. Cutter's face twisted, rage and shame battling in his eyes. He looked around at the men, every one of them staring back, silent, siding with her. And then he turned, storm at his back, and walked into the darkness. They never saw him again that night. Some said he rode off, shame biting harder than the rain. Others thought he was biding time, waiting for his chance. Either way, the ranch had changed. Back in the bunkhouse, the men crowded around Clara. Hank slapped her shoulder, laughing rough. "Girl, you're pure fire in a storm. Didn't think you'd live through that swing, but hell, you stood taller than any man here." Cal pressed a rag to her split lip, eyes soft. "You're a fool, you know that." Clara managed a shaky smile. "Guess so." But in her heart, something settled. She wasn't just tolerated anymore. She belonged. She'd proved it in mud and rain, under lightning and fists. Still, belonging doesn't mean safety. Not when a man like Cutter walks the world with hate in his gut. And Clara May Higgins was about to learn that storms don't end when the rain stops. Sometimes they just change shape. The storm broke and passed, but it didn't leave peace behind. That's the way of high plains tempests. They never just water the grass. They tear down fences, drive cattle to panic, and leave men stiff and sore, too tired to sleep, but too weary to rest. At first light, the bunkhouse door creaked open. Clara May Higgins stepped out into a world painted gray. The ground was mud thick enough to pull the soles off a man's boots. Fence posts leaned like drunks after a long night. Smoke from the storm-doused fire clung low. Her lip was split and swollen. Her shoulder burned where Cutter had slammed her down, but she carried her pail the same as always. Her steps were steady, and that mattered. You see, men don't always say much, but they notice. They notice who shows up after the storm. They notice who still carries their weight when everything hurt. When Clara staggered back from the spring, hair damp with morning mist, every tin cup was already set out on the bunkhouse table. Nobody asked. Nobody mocked. They just waited. She poured in silence, the water glugging like music in that hollow room. Hank Rourke, oldest and roughest, finally muttered, "Girl's tougher than a $2 steak." Laughter rippled. Not mean this time, but true. Even Talbot gave a short nod, his jaw working the stem of his unlit pipe. But one man's cup stayed empty, because Cutter wasn't there. By noon, trouble came riding. A neighbor from the south draw thundered into the yard, horse white with lather, eyes wild, his slicker dripped rain, his voice raw from shouting against the wind. "Cattle thieves," he rasped. "Took near 30 head, drove 'em into the canyon." Big fella with a scar on his jaw, leading him. Every man froze. Nobody needed the name. That scar was Cutter's mark, as much as his cold eyes. Talbot spat in the dirt. "Damn fool," he muttered. Then louder, "Saddle up." In minutes the yard was alive with motion. Horses stamped, saddles were cinched tight, rifles lifted from racks. With a heavy finality, Clara stood on the edge, her pail forgotten, heart thudding like a drum. Cutter wasn't gone. He hadn't ridden off to lick his wounds. He'd turned rustler, turned traitor, and now he'd dragged trouble straight back to the Barlow gates. The crew rode out under a sky still bruised with leftover storm. Clara mounted a sway-backed bay. Cal had saddled for her. "You don't have to come," he said low, glancing around. "Nobody will think less if you stay." She tightened the reins until her knuckles whitened. "I came this far. I won't stop now." Cal studied her face, saw the steel under the bruises, and didn't argue again. He just handed her a battered carbine. "Then aim careful, and don't shoot me with." The trail was plain, deep prints pressed into wet earth, dung, and churned mud where cattle had panicked. They followed it south, the land opening wide, until smoke curled thin on the horizon. Talbot raised his hand. The men spread, circling downwind. Voices dropped low. Horses pawed the mud, nervous. Clara's palms were slick on the carbine. She tried to quiet her breath, but every gust of wind seemed to carry Cutter's voice in it. The rustlers were sloppy. They thought the storm had covered their tracks. A fire burned in the hollow of the canyon, beef spit hissing, laughter rolling rough and careless. 6 men, hard and dirty, and Cutter at their center. He looked taller in the firelight, shadow cut sharp against the stone walls. The scar on his jaw glowed pale. Talbot whispered, "On my word," but the word never came. A rustler's head snapped up. Shouts rang. Rifles scraped from the ground. Gunfire split the night. The Barlow crew charged. Horses screamed. Sparks flew from stone. Smoke rolled thick. Clara's first shot went high. echoing off the canyon rim. She gritted her teeth, fired again. This time the bullet bit dirt at a rustler's boots, scattering him behind a rock. Hold the cattle, Cutter roared. His revolver flashed, the crack of it loud as thunder. Then his gaze found her, through smoke and chaos. His eyes locked on Clara. Recognition burned, then rage. "You," he bellowed. She froze. Everything around her blurred. Shouting men, stampeding cattle, flashes of gunfire. Until it was just Cutter striding toward her, revolver in hand, boots sinking deep in mud. She raised the carbine, breath ragged. "Stay back." Cutter grinned, teeth white. "You don't have the sand." He fired. The shot screamed past her cheek, stinging skin. She staggered, but didn't fall. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The carbine bucked. Cutter lurched, blood streaking his arm. He cursed, dropped his revolver, but didn't stop. "Respect's a man's game," he shouted. "You'll never earn it." He charged. She fired again. The bullet struck deep. Cutter's body folded, legs buckling. He staggered to his knees, eyes blazing with hate and something darker, fear. "They'll never accept you," he rasped, voice raw. Then he pitched forward into the mud, the firelight flickering across his still frame. The fight broke with him. The rustlers scattered, some bound by Barlow hands, others vanishing into the rocks. The stolen herd bawled, driven back toward the trail. Smoke drifted, heavy and bitter. Talbot stood over Cutter's body, shoulders broad, face unreadable. "Damn fool, man," he said finally. Then he turned, gaze settling on Clara. "You saved more than cattle tonight." Clara sank to the ground, the carbine slipping from her hands. Her whole body shook, not from cold but from the weight of what she'd done. Carl was beside her in a heartbeat, pulling his bandana to her lips, wiping blood. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt you again." But in her chest, Cutter's last words rattled like loose stones. "They'll never accept you." The ride back was long. The men said little, too wrung out to waste breath. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was bleeding pink across the horizon. Horses were unsaddled, rustlers were handed over to the sheriff riding in from town. Cattle bawled in the corrals, safe again, and Clara, bruised, raw, hands blistered, carried the first pail of water into the bunkhouse. No one asked, no one mocked. Every cup was already waiting. She poured steady, her arms trembling but her grip firm. When she reached Hank, he lifted his tin high. "To the girl who carried our water and carried us through hell." The men followed, cups raised, eyes fixed on her. Even Talbot, gruff and wordless, tipped his head. Clara didn't smile. She just nodded, because respect wasn't about smiling. It was about showing up. It was about hauling through storms, fire and bullets, and never breaking. Years later, when the Barlow hands had scattered to railroads, gold towns or graves, the story still traveled the plains. They told of the girl who wasn't supposed to last a week, the poor white girl who hauled water till her palms bled, who fought fire, faced down storms, and stood against the hardest man on the ranch. Some called her wild, others said she was touched by heaven, but most just called her what she was, Clara May Higgins. And if you ever rode through Wyoming long after those days, you might still hear her name over a campfire, spoken with a shake of the head and a glint in the eye, because every man who was there knew the truth. On that ranch, on that night, a girl they'd once laughed at became the kind of hero no one could ever forget.